It's a pleasure again to have been invited to share some time with you this evening and to be able to speak with you a little bit and interact with you a bit, particularly on this Black Solidarity Day, and to talk about consciousness, culture, and power. In some sense, sort of continuing our prior discussion in terms of consciousness, which off the bat to many people may seem somewhat abstract, but it is not an abstract situation. Consciousness is not an abstraction. It is a very concrete presence in the human mind and in our lives as people. One of the things that this culture tries to do very much to African people is to make us resist abstractions or things that sound abstract. Yet, it is in terms of the abstract that people act, that people actually control their behavior and the means by which people organize their behavior. Take the word nation. Really, what is it in reality? You cannot just find it in any concrete place or circumstance, and yet you can organize whole armies and people around the concept of nation. Nation as a symbol. You can generate all types of emotional feelings. You can move people to sacrifice their lives, to give their all in terms of what is essentially an abstraction, nation. And from the abstraction nation, we get the further abstraction nationalism. And yet nationalism has been the symbolic foundation by which means people have organized themselves and overthrown their oppressors, by which means colonialism has been rolled back and people have come to achieve an identity that has permitted them to operate as one and to mutually benefit one and the other. Those who rule us, you see, would like for us not to be comfortable with things that are not immediately concrete, with things that we cannot see in a tangible form or feel with our hands or feel in a material way. They seek to make then the black consciousness a concrete consciousness, to make it just a hands-on consciousness, you see, because that is the consciousness of servants. The consciousness of masters is a consciousness that wrestles with symbols and ideas, that wrestles with mathematics and logic, and uses those symbols to control the world and to change the world and to transform the world, organize it and direct it. Therefore, the masters of this world would like to make us think that abstract thinking is their preserve and not the preserve of those who serve. And many of us as African people have fallen for that kind of distinction. Many of us have tried to define our blackness in terms of our concreteness only, and not in terms of our ability to manipulate symbols and use symbols and manipulate abstractions as means of moving our behavior. The European has sought to make us a concrete people and a people who are only connected to the immediate by disconnecting us from our history and by taking over the responsibility for our past, and therefore making us not responsible for our past or responsible for our future. You see, in order to move into the past, one has to abstract himself or herself from the present, to move from the immediate, and yet to be moved by that which is not immediate, that which is not tangible, but yet in many ways is very important. When you deny then a people a past and a long past, in a sense, in effect, you begin to impair their abstract capacities and their abstract abilities, and you begin to impair their abilities to understand the present and redirect their behavior in the present in terms of the past, in terms of something that is not there in the immediate present. When you rob a people of responsibility for their future, again, rob them of having to move from the present into the future, to use their imagination, to use concepts that are placed into the distant future, and yet look at that future, deal with that future as a means of changing behavior in the present so that that future can be realized or avoided. So consequently, when African people, particularly African American people, were cut off from our past, and when we were made not responsible for our future, when the future was placed in the hands of another people, our ability to act in terms of abstractions, in terms of the not so immediate, but in terms of the future and based on the past, were impaired, and consequently many of us are caught up in the immediate present, in the immediately concrete. We have a short attention span and a short mental span. This is the kind of span for people who have been prepared to be servants, whose role in life is to carry out orders and orders only. If we then are to successfully defeat those people who rule us today, we must change the nature of our mentality to include our capacity to enter into abstractions and guide our behavior in terms of abstractions, to manipulate our consciousness and to manipulate the world in terms of the manipulation of symbols. We must lose our fear of dealing with ideas and concepts that appeared first to be intangible. And consciousness is one of those concepts, which, by the way, though, while on the surface it appears to be intangible and abstract, is the most concrete thing that we can deal with. I define consciousness as referring to a level of psychological and physiological arousal. So we know right away that consciousness is psychophysiological. That is, it is a combination of psychology and physiology. So it is not something that just floats in the psychological atmosphere. Consciousness is actually a body state. It is a brain state. That is why if you would take a drug, a psychoactive drug, which is a set of chemicals which are physical, those physical chemicals, when they enter into the brain, bring about psychological changes. That means then brain states, actual physical states, changes in the physical nature of the brain itself brings about psychological experiences and changes and orientations. One of the major reasons we take drugs is to change our consciousness. We use drugs as a means of manipulating our consciousness. When we want to party, we drink a little bit. We get a little high, and we feel like we're ready to party. We can laugh more easily, talk more easily, feel happier, have a lot of fun, and all these kinds of things. So we try to manipulate our consciousness through the manipulation of the chemical nature of our brains. I'm using this illustration to indicate then that consciousness is not a mere abstract psychological state, but it is a psychophysiological state. the physiological state of the brain is correlated with the psychological state of the mind, and the psychological state of the mind also transforms the physiological state of the brain as well. There is a reciprocal interaction between consciousness and brain state. I spoke here a few weeks ago at the Slave Theater about what we call the multiple personality. We talked about multiple personalities as states of consciousness, each personality representing a different state of consciousness. And we talked about how then one personality, if it had, say, a particular name, say Tom, when it possessed the body of the client, that personality, if orange juice was drank at the time that it was in possession of the body, that personality would function normally. However, if another personality entered the body, the drinking of orange juice would lead to a breaking out of rashes and welts on the body of the individual. And if Tom would come back into the body, if the consciousness of Tom would come back into the body while the rashes and welts were still present, they would begin to disappear immediately. Implying again then that these personalities were not mere states of consciousness, but they were psychophysiological states in that the actual physical nature of the body was correlated with each of the states of consciousness, such that depending on which personality was in possession of the body would have different reactions to the same circumstances or the same chemicals. Many times these multiple personalities may be of different ages as well as characters. So that if you would give, say, a tranquilizer of a certain amount to an adult personality, that personality might become agitated, such as when an adult may take speed or something, amphetamines. And yet, in that so-called same body, when the childish personality would enter into the body, the behavior would calm down. Behavior would be tranquilized as such. You can get differences in blood pressure, differences in all other kinds of physiological and psychological orientations, depending upon which consciousness or personality is in possession of the body. In effect, then, you had a different body when you had a different consciousness. And I use that then to illustrate the concrete and abstract nature of consciousness and how the consciousness that we see as typical of us as African Americans today, the kind of diseases, the kind of things to which we are vulnerable as a people is very much a consciousness that has been implanted in us by those who have power over us, that we as African people have yet to gain true possession of our bodies and of our minds. That the bodies we call our own today and the consciousness which possess the bodies that we call our own today are truly not our own, but are the bodies and minds and mentalities created by those who rule over us and create the consciousness that inhabits our bodies as a people. And we have to recognize then what is going on. We have to recognize then that consciousness is not a game, and consciousness is not an abstract concept. Consciousness is a real state by which people's bodies and minds are manipulated And therefore, if we are not the creators of our own consciousness as African people, and if consciousness is the means by which behavior is controlled and directed, and if consciousness is in essence the determinant of the nature of our bodies, then someone else who's creating our consciousness is also creating our bodies and creating our minds and our behavior. And I can argue at this point that we are not yet a self-creating people. This is what you mean when you talk about self-determination. So we refer to consciousness then as a level of psychological and physiological arousal, which facilitates the individual's awareness of his internal and external environment. In other words, to be conscious is to be conscious of. And consciousness means that we are conscious of our internal state. We are conscious of the fact that we are conscious. And we are conscious as well of our external environment. And the consciousness of our internal state and our external environment enables us, if we're in control of ourselves, to intentionally initiate and regulate our cognitive, that is our thinking behavior, and our behavioral activities toward the achievement of desired goals. That is, true consciousness, when it reaches a certain level of psychological and physiological arousal, permits us to intentionally or deliberately initiate and regulate our thinking patterns and our behavioral patterns toward achieving certain goals. Each level of consciousness makes possible and impossible certain types and forms of behavior in the achievement of some goals and not other goals. In other words, then, consciousness is a limiting case. It can extend our capacities to do things. At the same time, it limits our capacities. And we talked about it the last time, how sleep as a state of consciousness can permit us to restore our bodies, can permit us to dream, to consolidate the experiences we have undergone during the day. Wakefulness can permit us to do very active things, to coordinate our physical being, to achieve certain goals that we cannot achieve when we are asleep. Even within sleep, there are several stages of consciousness. We talk about dream consciousness, for instance. We talk about REM sleep, non-REM sleep, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 sleep. We talk about various levels of consciousness in terms of brain wave activities, theta wave activity, beta wave, alpha wave activities, and other wave activities, and how those states of consciousness is represented by brain wave activities, by levels of sleep, are correlated with the capacity of the individual to achieve certain ends. The same thing is true then in terms of waking consciousness. There are many different levels of consciousness there. Each one of those levels can permit us to achieve certain things, but limit our capacity to achieve other things. So again, consciousness is the central instrument for solving our problems and for confronting the world. We have to keep that in mind when we talk about this concept. The nature of consciousness is emotional, intellectual, and social character is influenced to a marked degree by the social relations and experiences to which it has been exposed during its most impressionable developmental period. What are we saying here then? Consciousness, to a great extent, is socially manufactured. Now keep this in mind. If we're saying consciousness determines the state of our mind, determines the state of our bodies, if consciousness facilitates our behavior and at the same time inhibits our behavior, depending upon the state of consciousness we're in, if it is used to guide our behavior then it becomes very important as to where that consciousness comes from and how it is originated. And we must keep in mind then that consciousness is not something that just is unique to us as an individual person, but it actually is generated by the kinds of social experiences that we have had. In other words, those people who have had control and influence in our lives in such a way that they have influenced the kinds of social interactions we've had, the kind of social conditions under which we've lived, the kind of educational experiences and socialization experiences we've undergone. Those people who have that kind of influence, to a great extent, have been those who've shaped our consciousness. That is why, again, we talk about African-centered education. Because we recognize that the type of education and the type of socialization which people undergo will to a great degree determine the type of consciousness they come to exhibit. And if we have the consciousness which will advance the interests of African people, we must undergo an African-centered experience. We must undergo African-centered social interactions. We must organize our environment in such a way that it produces an African-centered way of thinking. One of the other things I want to mention here then is not only individual consciousness, but we have what you might call group consciousness. If the sets of information, and information is a major part of consciousness, modes of information processing, we talked about that the last time we were here, that is, it is not enough just to have information, but we must possess the means of processing that information, subjecting the information we have to thought, to logic, to reasoning, to analysis, to abstraction, to conceptualization, to mobility. That is, we must move the information that we have about and coordinate that information in certain directions. It is not then the mere information that we have available to us that is important, but it is the means by which we process that information that is of equal importance. And we talked in our last lecture about how whites seek to falsify black consciousness by falsifying the information that's contained in our consciousness. Number one. By filling our consciousness with irrelevant information.
Talk about it.
By filling our consciousness with ignorance.
Sure.
Europeans may even fill our consciousness with relevant information. And they pump a lot of it out there. A lot of it. A lot of information out there. See, there are a lot of us who say we don't want to read anything by Europeans, written by Europeans. That's a mistake. That's a serious mistake. As I used to tell my class, as I opened up the general psychology classes and other classes, every means, and as I got them to look at their textbook, I said, every means by which we are manipulated and controlled is contained right in this book. This white man has written it out for you, right here.
Every day.
Yes, all the time. I'm amazed at the amount of information these people lay out. But as I said, they have no fear of laying out the information because, see, they have come to understand the old adage. If you want to hide something from a Negro, what do? Put it in writing. Put it in writing. Yes. Because he gets sleepy when he reads. He gets headaches. He hates to use the dictionary. He hasn't developed his vocabulary. You know? Bored quickly by reading. Yeah. Or he's interested in nothing that is written. Or he's interested only in very narrowly focused knowledge. Knowledge that prepares him to be a servant only. dares him to close his mind to reality. And therefore the white man enjoys freedom of the press. He can write blatantly and boldly in terms of the means by which he controls Negroes. He can project how he will control them. He discusses day in and day out the means by which Negroes will be manipulated without having any fear that he will be read by Negroes. Oh yeah. And then some of us, you see, we've been duped so much we have such an emotional problem until we still will not see what's in front of our eyes. I've often said, in order for us to be in the condition we're in, we have not to be able to see the obvious. That's a very, very important thing. We must be unable to see what is immediately in front of our faces. Yeah. In order for us to be in the condition we are in, we must be unable to use our common sense. In fact, it's interesting, as I've said before, that whites will even call, and other blacks will call a person like myself, Afrikan, and others, radical. And yet, when you listen to us carefully, we are very conservative. Yeah, very commonsensical. There's little, if anything, radical about what we say. What is radical about telling people that they should feed themselves? What is radical about telling grown adult people that they should do for self? What is radical about telling people that they should run their own nations, own their own lands, control their own internal market? What is so radical about that? Yes, this is what we're trying to say. Other people take that for granted. Other people see that as just what? Common sense. Yes. But you see, what the whitey has done, and non-thinking Negroes have done, is that they have radicalized common sense. They have told and made Negroes think that what is common sense is radical. And therefore, we reject common sense in rejecting the radical. And that is why we do not pursue things that anybody with common sense would do or pursue. Because some have told us that that's revolutionary.
How about that?
And radical. And that is why we defeat ourselves and destroy ourselves. People rule over us. The people who rule over us read, develop vocabularies, manipulate the word. And yet, there are those among us who believe that we must reject this. It must be obvious that the capacity to manipulate the word is a power, is a source of power. Those of you who belong to the Christian religion know about that. First there was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And that God creates the world through what? Words and symbols. And first comes the symbol. First comes the concept as symbol. Then follows concrete reality. And this is the way man operates. This building was first conceived as a symbol, as an idea. It was first conceived in terms of a lot of words moving back and forth. A lot of words being written. A lot of symbols being drawn on paper. A lot of numbers being added and subtracted and multiplied and all of these kinds of things. A lot of abstract things being moved back and forth like money. Greenbacks, the symbols of wealth. Yes. Architects' drawings and so forth. All what? Symbols, symbols, symbols. Words, as a result of the transformation of these symbols into concrete activities, ultimately leading then to a concrete construction. We therefore ignore the development of our capacity to manipulate symbols and words and to read. We suffer as a result of our avoidance of the development of those capacities. We have too many youngsters out here today who think, and particularly males, who think to read, to know words, to have knowledge is to be effeminate, is to be non-black, is to be nerdy. And yet it's the nerds of the world that are running it. Yeah. Yeah. It's those nerds right outside out here on this block that are intimidating us on these streets. Yeah. Those people that stayed there long enough at least to pass those exams and gain the physical force to intimidate us on these blocks. So group consciousness, we'll talk about it as the sets of information. If the sets of information, modes of information processing, and we said again that whites seek to falsify black behavior, not only in terms of falsifying the information of which we operate, that's contained in our consciousness, they seek to impair the modes of information processing, the means by which we process the information that we have available to us. And we indicated too then that they sought to manipulate the values, and we're going to come back, that give consciousness direction. If the sets of information, modes of information processing, values and skills which define and direct an individual's consciousness are shared by or compatible with those of other individuals who mutually consider themselves to be the members of a distinct group, then it may be inferred that he, that individual, and the members of the group have generated and shared a group consciousness. In other words, the degree to which the sets of information and the way we process information and the values and the skills we have available to us are shared by others who belong to the same group we do, then, or to the degree that their skills and modes of processing information and information that they have available to them is compatible with our individual consciousness, then the group to which we belong shares then what we call a group consciousness. To the degree that such a group has been formed as the result of the fact that its members share a shared or common history, a shared or common ancestry or ethnicity, has been socialized according to the same or similar social practices as prescribed by the same or similar institutions, and has been trained and motivated to act and interact in ways which maintain and advances the interests of the group, it can be inferred that they participate in sharing a culture or a cultural consciousness. What are we saying here then? People come to share a group consciousness or a cultural consciousness. Now we're moving beyond the individual consciousness into a group consciousness. And how then do individuals come to share a group consciousness or a cultural consciousness? By sharing a common social history. We are here this evening as black folk, as African folk, because we share a common history as African folk and black folk. This is a part of our consciousness as a people. We share a common ancestry, our African ancestry. We have been socialized, unfortunately not by African institutions and people, but the same, we have been socialized according to some social practices, according and by means of some institutions, these Eurocentric schools and these other institutions. And we have been trained and motivated to act and interact in ways, unfortunately, not to maintain our African selves, but to maintain the well-being of Europeans. Yet we still share a group consciousness and a cultural consciousness. And it is that consciousness that we're going to have to transform as people. A part of the transformation of this consciousness is the goal of an African-centered education, an African-centered socialization, where people come to know their history, come to identify with their ancestry, where African-based institutions becomes the means by which we are socialized, not Eurocentric institutions. And African-based and centered families become the means by which we are socialized. So that as a result of being socialized through African-based institutions, socialized by African-centered families, socialized around African-centered values and history, we will achieve a group consciousness which is African-centered. And once achieving that consciousness, we can act in the interest of African people. Group consciousness is an adaptational tool. Its operational presence facilitates the ability of otherwise exclusively self-interested individuals to cooperatively coordinate and organize their activities toward the achievement of the goals they find mutually desirable. What are we saying here then? Consciousness is a tool. It is a means by which we adapt to our environment and adapt our environment to ourselves. But more than that, group consciousness allows us to get people who would ordinarily be merely interested in themselves as individuals to cooperate one with the other, to coordinate their behavior and to organize their behavior in cooperative ways, to achieve an end that moves beyond them as individuals, to achieve ends that are good for the group, achieve an end that they as members of the group find mutually to their benefit. Because we must recognize ultimately that the group is an extension of the individual. That the individual uses the group and is used by the group because the group can attain things that the individual by himself or herself cannot attain or achieve. 99% of the things that we probably are involved with today are the result of group activities. Whether it's the clothes we wear, the cars we drive, the food we eat, the transportation we use, you name it, one thing after the other. These things are the result of coordinated human behavior, of groups deciding and individuals in groups deciding to coordinate their behavior, to synchronize their behavior, so that those things could be produced for the enjoyment of the group as a whole and for the enjoyment of individuals as a whole. Think of how much trouble we would have if we tried to produce everything as an individual that we enjoy and that we use. As a matter of fact, many of the things we enjoy and use would be impossible for us to achieve as an individual. That is why ultimately then we share a group consciousness, because many of the individual things we desire can only be achieved through group activity. So in a sense, the individual is born for the group and the group for the individual. One of the ways that the European seeks to disempower African people is to make each one of us think that we can exist as an island unto ourselves. That we are individuals, each doing his own thing. This is the reason why many of the achievements that other people have made through coalescing into a group have been made unavailable to us because we've been too busy being individuals. The only place where you have pure individuality, and even it's not that pure, but where individuality is taken to an extreme, where each person in there is busy doing his own thing, is in an insane asylum. Where there's so much into being each one doing his own thing until they have to be controlled by outsiders. Which is pretty much our situation today.
That's true.
Because as I've told you many times before, in order for us to be in the condition we are in as African people, we have to be what? Out of our minds. We literally have to be crazy. Yes, into a deceptive state of consciousness, which does not permit us to operate as a group and to coordinate our behavior as a group, and puts us at odds one with the other, and therefore making group-achieved ends impossible. This is what group consciousness is about. This is what culture is about. Culture, too, is a tool, and you don't find any group that has undergone a shared history, shared experiences, and that shares a particular environment over time that does not develop a culture. Because culture is the means by which a group gains control over itself and over its members, and controls the behavior and consciousness of its members as a means of achieving a particular end, as a means of confronting the problems that are common to the group, as a means of manipulating nature and using nature to advance its own ends. Consciousness, therefore, whether individual consciousness or group consciousness, is therefore the premier instrument of social control. In other words, consciousness is the means by which we control ourselves, our behavior. As individuals, and group consciousness and cultural consciousness is the means by which we control ourselves as members of a group. To a good extent, culture is the outward and visible and productive expression of a group's inner consciousness. In other words, we pretty much can look at the culture of the people and get a pretty good idea of the organization of their group consciousness and of their individual consciousness, of the content of their consciousness, of the informational processing abilities of their consciousness, and the values which direct their consciousness. And we have to keep this kind of thing in mind because culture itself is our most practical tool as a group for dealing with the world. One of the things I want to speak to for a bit tonight, because consciousness and culture is so many-sided and multifaceted, is to speak to consciousness as ideology. Consciousness as a set of beliefs. When we talk about, we view as the facts, the knowledge that we have as such, in our consciousness, in our minds, in our brains, that are available to us for use. We also must recognize that the contents of consciousness includes our beliefs, the myths that we have in our minds, our beliefs about ourselves and about the world. This is a very, very important part of consciousness because we act on our beliefs, whether those beliefs are based in fact or not. We act on mythology, whether that mythology is based on fact or not. Thus, though consciousness is a product of actual experience, as we said earlier, and of social experience, it is essentially ideological since it is shaped and motivated and directed on the basis of shared beliefs, customs, expectations, myths, and values. In other words, Consciousness not only operates in terms of our concrete knowledge, in terms of information that we have available to us, in terms of processing the knowledge and information, but in terms of what we believe, in terms of customs, in terms of what we expect of ourselves and expect the future to bring, in terms of myths and values. It's very important that we focus on this concept of culture as ideology, consciousness as ideology, as beliefs. Remember again, we said what? We use consciousness and culture to direct our behavior, to deal with the world. Remember as well that consciousness, because it directs our behavior, and through our behavior we have an effect on the world. Consciousness then is a power because it enables us to influence the world, to influence others. It enables us to determine how the world is going to influence us and to determine the effect that others will have on us. Therefore, consciousness is a power. It is a means and an instrument by which we manipulate the world. We manipulate the outer world and others in that world, as well as we manipulate our inner world and ourselves. It's important that we keep in mind. And yet that consciousness that's doing all of these things is based on, to a good extent, our beliefs, our ideas, our myths. It's very important that we keep that in mind because we have to ask the question, what are the sources of our beliefs, of the myths that we use to create our consciousness? What are the sources of our expectations and our values? Are they the sources from African history? Are they beliefs developed based on reality? Are they beliefs based on racist ideologies, racist propaganda, having been exposed to racist institutions, racist living conditions, and other conditions? Since culture is to a great extent ideological, and consciousness is ideological, and since culture and consciousness are powers, this implies then that those who control our consciousness and those who control our culture use the power of our consciousness and culture to advance their own ends. This is why we call Eurocentric culture a vampiristic culture, a culture of vampires, one that sucks the blood, that uses the power of potential African consciousness and potential African culture as a means for furthering its own end. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, it is this artificially created set of beliefs which involves this artificially created consciousness and culture that we call black consciousness and black culture, which provides the power for European domination. As I've said time and time again, the European cannot be what he is unless what? We are what we are. While we emphasize the degree to which we are the Frankenstein people of Europeans, we must also recognize that we created these people as well. And we continue to create them and sustain them to the degree that we let them create our culture and create our consciousness as a people. If culture then is ideological in its fundamental sense, it means, as was argued by Wartburg in his book, The Forms of Power, which I advise people to read, never mind that the man is a Jew. The Forms of Power, Thomas Wattenberg, because as I told you earlier, these people lay out in that text exactly how they control us and manipulate us. They lay out the prescriptions by means of which we can be controlled as African people. There's a book that I recommend, a book written again, I guess, by a Jewish person, doesn't really matter, by the name of Shapiro, called The Neurotic Personality, I believe. Maybe called another name. And I recommend it when students come to me for mentoring, one of the first books I recommend. Because it talks about neurotic styles. That's what it's called, neurotic styles, not neurotic, by Shapiro. Classic book, because it defines the cognitive, the thinking styles of different neurotic orientations. You know, and it's a classic in that sense. Just how do obsessive compulsive people think and see the world? How do paranoid people think and deal with the world? What's their style of thought? There's a style that's called the hysterical personality. And this is not a personality necessarily that's a hilarious personality, but it's a personality that is highly impressionable, highly influenceable, if we could say that word. It's a personality often that converts its psychological problems into physical problems and into physical handicaps and into psychosomatic disorders. It is generally a highly emotional personality, defined more by its emotionality than by its intellectuality. It's defined more in terms of its fuzziness, of its willingness to be approximate rather than exact. Mind you of somebody? Of its responsivity to superficial impressions rather than looking beyond the surface. It is a personality that has a messianic complex that guides it, that some kind of Moses, some kind of Jesus, or some kind of knight in white armor, whatever you call it, is going to come and rescue it from this situation. It's one of those personalities that believe that there's a rocket ship up there somewhere that's going to come down and save black folk. Oh yes, yes, father ships and uncle ships and all other kind of ships. It's that personality that even said Jesus is black. Maybe. That gives me a problem. Jesus is black, and we catch the hell we'll catch him. I wonder what kind of black man he is. Acts more like a white man to me. But that's another story. But there's that hysterical personality, and he goes on and he describes this personality in great detail. But the thing that he says at the center of that personality is that this is a personality that is based on no sense of history, of long history and of enduring history. You see what I'm saying? That a hallmark of this hysterical personality, this emotionally laid out personality, this personality that reacts to superficiality, this personality that is focused on the immediate, in the immediate present, this personality that lives in wishful thinking, is that it is characterized by the fact that it is not based on a long and enduring history and sense of history, and that it is not guided by a long and abiding sense of the future and where it wants to go. That means then that this kind of personality finds little reason to resist immediate distractions. Because, in a sense, if it is not guided by deep and abiding expectations and purposes, it has no reason not to enjoy the immediate. It has no reason not to be distracted by the immediate. It is a personality where impulses are immediately acted upon without thinking. But you can see, if you have no long-term goals, if you have no deeply held values that you want to realize in the distant future, there is no reason to resist immediate emotions or immediate impulses. There's no reason to hold back and suppress those impulses in the interest of achieving future goals. If you don't have future goals, why hold back? But if you have deep future goals, then you bring judgment to apply. And you say, should I indulge this impulse? Should I indulge this desire? Because if indulging it would mean that I will be diverted from a very valuable goal, I'll be unable to reach a deeply held goal that rests in the future, then I must resist this emotion. I must transform its energy in such a way that it can lead to my achieving the goals that I have in mind. The college student who is tempted, or the high school student, or any student who's tempted by the party, who's tempted to hide out, or to hang out, must look at that temptation and look at it and measure it against long-term goals, long-term wishes and purposes, and see in what way it either contributes or destroys his effort to achieve those goals. And once making that judgment, applies this capacity to repress the impulse and to sit at the desk, to sit at the book, and to continue to read and to study and to continue to develop those skills and other means necessary to achieve long-term goals. Now, when Shapiro talks about that, you can read this as a characteristic of the hysterical person, of this neurotic style, or you can read it as a prescription for creating hysterical people. You see? In other words, you can say, if you are a master and you wish to create a people who are concerned only with the immediate, who are easily distractible, who have problems concentrating, who have poor memories, who respond to the colorful, who do not see beyond the surface, who have problems of controlling their impulses, who are subject to all kinds of addictions and so forth, I tell you what you do. Number one, you rob them of any sense of enduring what? History. And a sense of continuity and a sense of connectedness with the past. You do that first. And then you rob them of a set of values to which they're highly committed, a set of purposes to which they intend to fulfill. You rob them of the desire to be in control of their future and to create the kind of future they want instead of depending upon someone else to create the future that they must live in. You rob them of these two things and you will create this kind of mentality. When you read the psychology texts, you can read them then in terms of the symptoms of people who have problems, or you can read them in terms of how you create people so that they can what? Have problems. You see, each time you read about a neurotic style or some kind of neurosis, they go into what? Early family experience, don't they? Mm-hmm. Mother-child relationships, things of this nature. The kind of social environment that seems to have combined to have created this kind of style. Just don't read this then this way. Read it then in the way that says there are people who have destabilized families in such a way. They have created environments in such a way. They They have generated then certain ideas and things in such a way that they tend to create a large number of people with particular types of social and mental styles within a particular group.
Teach, brother.
Am I getting to you here?
Absolutely.
You must understand. See, this is the reason why it's not the material that the Europeans put before you, it's the approach to the material that is important. They will reveal to you things that they never intended to reveal. The idea is to subvert their intentions to your own intentions. And you can subvert any Eurocentric information. I don't care whether they meant to lie or not to lie, or they tell it facts or not facts. You can subvert any of them if you have an African-centered perspective. Because it is that perspective which transforms any reality into one that works for African people. Even if it's Eurocentric lies, it still works. You have to understand this then. So if culture is ideological, so he says here, that means then that people can be ruled in terms of their ideas. As Wartburg goes on to say, and also another book you can read in this regard, Nietzsche, The Genealogy of Morals. There is an inherent tendency for the dominant to secure their position of dominance by developing misunderstandings among the dominated concerning reality and what is happening to them. One group's domination of another can come about simply through its ability to get the members of the other group to conceive of themselves or the world in a particular way. In other words, if consciousness and culture are ideological, then we can grab control of other people's consciousness and of their culture through manipulating their beliefs and manipulating their ideas. In some, it is possible for one group to dominate another group simply by the means of ideas, by getting that group to think about themselves and the world in a manner that allows them to be subjugated. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if we are a subjugated people, we in part have cooperated with our subjugation.
Unconsciously.
Particularly when we have not examined the ideas upon which we operate. We have not reassessed and maybe even exorcised from our minds and our bodies ideas that we use to guide our behavior. If the ideas that are at center of our consciousness and of our culture are ideals placed there by Europeans, then it is through these ideas that the Europeans dominate us. And it is through these ideas that we mistakenly call our own, that we collude in our subjugation. I want to emphasize that, even though it may appear unfair to some people, and it may appear that I'm placing a lot of the blame on us, and to a degree I am, because if we are to change these circumstances, it is going to be through our transformation as people that they're changed. We cannot depend upon the change of other people. And we must look then at the degree to which we are a part of our own problem. And how then, by changing the part over which we can gain control, we can change the nature of the problem and perhaps even resolve it. A similar idea can be stated in reference to values. Valuation is a means by which a social group can use to gain, is a means that a social group can use to gain power over another group, even when that latter group seems to be in a position to dominate the former. In other words, the values that we use can be the tools of another group by means of which that other group has gained control over us, even when we are in a position to overthrow that other group. This situation that we have right out here on this street is a situation that we can come to dominate. We do not have to be dominated out here, economically, the way we are being dominated. As I will demonstrate later on, we are being dominated mainly through the ideas that we've permitted to inhabit our consciousness as a people. Not by those cops on the block per se, not by those alien vendors in the shops, but by the very values we have inculcated in ourselves as a people, or we've permitted other people to inculcate in us. One group of human beings can use the minds of a group of other human beings as the chains of their own servitude. What did I tell you? That in order for us to be in the condition we are in as African people, we would have to be in a state of deception. We would have to be in that state that's similar to the one I talk about that says, if the midget controls the giant, then the giant must see the midget as a giant and himself as a what? As a midget. Black people are in the condition we're in today because our consciousness has been reversed. And because the values we pursue reverse our consciousness and our culture. We are then enchained by the ideas that we call our own. And we are enchained by our own mind more than we are enchained by Europeans. Because people's beliefs have a constitutive effect on what they do and allowed to be done, domination can be constituted within the realm of belief alone. Because, in a sense, what we are, and we are what we are to a significant extent because of what we believe. That's what we mean when we say constituted. We then can be dominated by our beliefs alone. If we do things based on our beliefs, and we allow things to be done based on our beliefs, then domination, which determines what we do and what we allow to be done, can be achieved over us based on beliefs alone. Beliefs and values. Now let's get more to the concrete aspect of what I talked about here. To a good extent, the situation where we find black vendors on the streets of the main commercial areas of their community is a result of an ideology, or an economic ideology that we have. I've said before that we should, as an African people, think of ourselves in terms of a nation. We should use the nation as the unit of analysis, not our individual selves, not even our families, but ourselves as a nation. Yes. We should see ourselves in America as a nation within a nation. And it's very important that we do that because it will permit us to understand problems in ways that we could never understand them if we looked at ourselves as individuals or merely as members of families. And of course, this is what the other people like to lay on us. They love to talk about us in terms of individual and family background, but not in terms of an African nation in America. There are good reasons for that. You can see many things if you use the nation concept that you cannot see from an individual point of view. You can also see solutions to problems that you cannot arrive at if you look at them in individualistic and familialistic terms. One of the things that we recognize when we see ourselves as an African nation is, like any other nation, we have a general economic ideology, a set of beliefs about economics that's a part of our problem. What is that ideology? It is the ideology of the free market. You know, people talk about that all the time, right? free markets, open markets. We are the only nation in America, and I'm referring to other nations, the white nation, the Korean nation, the Arab nation, the Hispanic nation. We're the only nation on this continent, and really in the world, that actually believes sincerely in free markets and open markets. Oh yeah, you've heard whites talk about open markets and free markets. They talk about it, but they don't believe it. They use that to manipulate the behavior of other people. The United States of America maintained a closed economic market from its inception until 1915, until the very First World War. It protected that market against the free entry of all other nations, including Mother Britain. It did not even permit the English, who to a great extent, along with other Europeans, financed its development. That is, while it used the merchants of Amsterdam and the merchants of France, the merchants of Europe and England to finance its economic growth, it did not permit them a free ride and free trade within the American market. It protected those markets. It heavily taxed any outside nations that sought to trade with it as a means of protecting its own developing industries, so that its own industries could develop without the competition of mature industries based in other nations and places. It did it. England itself did not even have a free market. It destroyed the armadas of Spain, of Portugal, and of France to keep them from competing with itself. And yet you claim free market is some American idea or European idea. You're going to find, ladies and gentlemen, that one of the things capitalists like least is competition. They talk about it, but they try like hell to do what? Destroy it. That's right. The whole idea of the major capitalist is not to maintain competition, but to what? Destroy it and remove it. And yet they'll talk about free competition, free and open competition. And the very ones talking about it are creating monopolies, cartels, corners to destroy competition. The major thing a capitalist wants is an organized market and a predictable market. And we don't have time to go into, this is a fascinating history. When you read, say, the robber barons, or you read the early history of J.P. Morgan, Carnegie, read those histories. These are people, by the way, that Booker Washington was very familiar with. Carnegie, he knew personally. Carnegie even financed some of his stuff. Of John D. Rockefeller. I think in part, you see, when we read the history of our people, we should also read the context of the general American history in which they existed. I believe to a degree it was due to the fact that Booker T. Washington was in direct contact with people like Andrew Carnegie, with the Morgans, or with these major capitalists, that he recognized that power rested in the economic control of production. In what? The ownership of property. In the control of capital. Not in voting, as W. Du Bois was so deceived in thinking. Yes, because he recognized as he observed the behavior of Carnegie's and Rockefellers and Morgans and Goulds and the other ones that were out there, that they were the ones actually running the United States and determining its future. Not the voters, not the congressmen. They were bribing the congressmen. They were bribing the legislatures. They were determining the outcome of elections. They were determining the nature of the U.S. government and its relationship. They had the United States government give them something like 150 million acres literally free of charge. And they used the taxes of the people to finance their own development and for their own private benefit. And so it didn't matter how the people voted. It didn't matter that they voted in the Congress, that they voted in the Senate, that they voted in the president. In the end, these people essentially were the water boys of those who own the means of production and own property in the world. And ultimately, it is those who own property who will control the lives of the propertyless, no matter how much they vote. And I think Booker Washington, interacting with these men to a greater degree than W.E.B. Du Bois, was able to understand that the foundations of power in America was the ownership of property, and the ownership of means of production, and the ownership of real skills, you see, and the ownership of human capital and resources, and the excluding of certain other groups from the ownership of that property, and the ownership of certain skills and resources. This is the basis of power, because power is never equally shared in any society. Power is unequally shared. And those who have the most of it are those who are in control of the major resources of the society, not those who merely have a vote in their hands. You see? And yet we have that kind of game going on out here today. These jokers you're voting for have already been bought by the capitalists. Yes. Yes. And I'll tell you later, even when you vote them in to office, their legislation, their governance will be dictated by the structure of finance capital and the corporate system. Yes. You see how afraid they are to raise taxes? You see how everybody is running to lower taxes? Even though they're chopping what? Hospitals, schools, destroying people's jobs, and the country is regressing in terms of its infrastructure and so forth. And yet, people, almost everyone who's running for office is saying what? Lower taxes. We're going to cut taxes. Then by what means do you finance important social institutions if the people do not finance them through their tax dollars and so forth? Well, it appears that a decision has been made, hasn't it? That those institutions, particularly those that serve African people, will be what? Destroyed and cut back. Why? Because black people are going out there to vote tomorrow? No. Because the global capitalist, the transnational companies in this country have told these governments that they will not locate jobs, they will not locate factories, they will not locate other institutions in their states and in their regions if they maintain their taxes at a particular level. In fact, they call it creating a business climate. You hear that all the time, don't you? You ever wonder what that meant? To create the appropriate business climate? That means a business that does not want to pay taxes. That means a business that wants a tax break. And we're going to talk about these things. New York City is broke to a good degree because it has a lot of major capital resources in here that are not paying taxes at all. Many hotels and many other capital institutions here have received tax holidays, some for 10, some for 15, some for 20 years. These capitalists now make these states and cities and locales compete against one another to get their factories. And they compete against one another by reducing to its lowest degree the amount of taxes that that corporation would have to pay. And often they set it up in such a way that the corporation has to pay no taxes. I've talked to you about the Mercedes-Benz plant in Alabama, where the state gave it a tax credit of $300 million. Where the city in which it was located contributed $30 million to purchasing the land upon which that factory would be set. And the state kicked in another $5 million to grade the land. And with this $300 million tax break, you see, the Mercedes-Benz built a $300 million factory. Which meant what? That Mercedes-Benz didn't have to pay a thing. And it meant then that the people of Alabama bought 15,000 jobs very expensively. It literally meant then that Mercedes-Benz was paid, used the public monies to further its own private ends. It means that the services, the social services and the other services that must be supplied by the state will continue to be paid by the taxpayers. Another thing that these businesses demand, if you're going to create an appropriate business climate, is to reduce taxes that go to welfare, social services, and other areas they deem as non-productive areas. They see these areas as not generative of profits and so forth, and therefore they demand that their taxes not be used, if they pay them, to support people who are in need of it through the social service systems. And this is what you see happening in this state. This is what you see happening all over the country. The capitalists are saying, if you're going to have us in, then you must do this. So even after the people vote them in,
Still got to do it.
the legislature, because it's hamstrung by these capitalists, are unable to protect the people's interests. This is the kind of game that goes on there. And others will say, if you keep raising taxes, or if you keep supporting these people in these inner city schools, if you keep supporting these people through these inner city hospitals, if you keep supporting these people through welfare payments and other kinds of payments, we will move our factories out. And the legislators then, because they don't want to be accused of losing jobs. So you hear many of these guys say, so-and-so lost 10,000 jobs. And so. We just say, we are going to do what's necessary to keep the jobs here. And therefore, if to keep the jobs here, we have to shut down schools and hospitals and so forth and so on, this is what we will do. And this is going to be voted in by your legislators and by your governors and so forth, regardless of the fact of how you vote for them, because the capitalists have a stronger hand over them than do the voters. You got to learn what this is about. So we didn't believe in free markets. What do I mean by free market? This situation out here on 125th Street is one where we believe Koreans and Arabs and whites and every other person with black folk are free to move in and earn money any way they feel like earning. And not only can they earn that money out there, they are free to take it out of the neighborhood and out of the community without paying 1 ounce of taxes, without making one contribution to its social institutions, without hiring any significant number, if any, of its members, without supporting any of its cultural and other institutions and establishments. They are free to come in and earn the wealth and tuck that wealth right out. Because they are what? Americans, just like we are. And we live in a multicultural society. And they have as much right as we do to be on the street. That's why we have it. But nations don't operate that way. Nations do not see alien groups as having as much right to take advantage of their wealth as they do themselves. Nations don't see alien nations as having more right to carry the wealth out of the nation than the nation has itself to benefit from its wealth. No nations believe that are truly of themselves. The struggle you have now going on between, the only way the United States pushed free markets, which it talks about so much, is because the United States at that time was the one that had most of the money and most of the wealth. And therefore, by convincing other people to believe in free markets, by convincing other people that they should not protect their markets, that they should not protect their property, that they should not protect their land, that they should not protect their wealth, that they should leave their wealth exposed to United States investments. The United States, because of the wealth advantage it had, preached free market, not because it believed in democracy, because it believed in individual freedom and so forth, we know better, but because when it got people to believe in that ideology, those people would open their markets to this country, and the United States capitalists could enter into their market and come to and own every valuable piece of property and wealth that belonged to that nation, and could suck that wealth out of that nation and leave its people impoverished. Even though they felt righteous, because, they believed in free markets. You have not seen any nation on this earth consume itself into power. Gain power by what? Spending only. You will never see a nation that is a nation of consumers ever be a free nation and a powerful nation in this world. You will only see nations who've made it in this world economically, that are nations that are what? Productive, and have control over the means of production, which means property, resources, both human and non-human resources and materials. There is no way you're going to exercise real power in this nation and in this world if you believe that your wealth and possibilities can be freely given without any kind of stipulation to any other group of people. I don't care how righteous it sounds, it's not going to happen. And yet we have that kind of ideology out here. And that is the reason we suffer the way we do. We have the ideology of individualism. Each of us doing his own thing. Yet the building of these stores, the occupying of these stores by other groups is done by a coordinated system of activities. It's done on the basis of institutions and group behavior, not just mere individuals pursuing their own self-interest, but of individuals who have coalesced and combined their resources so that this could happen. We are in the condition we're in, and the situation is the way it is out there, because our consciousness is a reactionary consciousness. It is more concerned with defending our injured egos than with advancing our interests. It is a consumerist consciousness that is absorbed by consumption and buying and eating more than it is with producing. It sees the end of life as continuous consumption. It sees the very meaning of life as contained in consuming and buying, not in owning and controlling. We don't care who sells us just as long as we can buy. Just as long as you get out of the way and let me get to the white man and give him my money. We only concerned with how we can consume, not how we can produce. And because we have that as our central concern, we are under the control of other people. Our values are values such that we value being smiled at by Koreans more than owning the businesses that they have and feeding our children through their profits. We value their superficial friendship more than we value transferring the wealth that we have in our pockets to our children and creating jobs for ourselves and for our families. We value being accepted by whites, which we'll never get, more than we value self-acceptance. We value jobs and working for white folk, and value being identified and gaining our status based on the white plantation we work on than the one we own and control ourselves. When you have then a people caught up with the ideology of free markets, individualism, consumerism, the desire to be accepted and loved by their masters, a desire to work for rather than to employ and create employment, you have the kind of situation you got right out there on 25th Street, on all of the 125th streets across America, on all of the 125th streets across the Caribbean, across the whole African diaspora, including Mother Africa itself.
Yes.
If you go to Kenya, you'll see the African vendors on the outside, on the sidewalk, and the East Indians and Arabs on the inside, in the shops. If you go to Ivory Coast, you'll see the French people in the boutiques and on the inside, and the Africans wear it on the outside. You go to Caribbean, you go to any place here, you see the same kind of game. Why? Because we are imbued with the same kind of false values and the same kind of false beliefs and the same kind of false orientation toward consumption rather than ownership. We believe that our communities should be free markets when no other community permits such a market to occur within themselves. As I've told you before, the reason why we're in the condition we're in is because we look at ourselves as a nation. We see that we've let the Korean nations and the other nations invade our internal markets, take the money and the wealth out of those internal markets back to their own neighborhoods and communities and nations. On top of that, we have seen that they block us from access to their markets, and therefore we are in a double bind. We are blocked from access to the markets of aliens because they do not let people freely walk into those markets. And we are blocked from access to our own internal markets, and therefore we must operate in the cracks between the two. And those groups then make it illegal for such an operation to occur, and therefore the black economy ceases to exist. And this is based on our belief, not even on their orientation, but our belief. Because if we didn't believe in these free markets, we would not support these people without spending. And they are only here because we spend money with them here, and we keep them here. And we spend money with them because we have false ideologies and false beliefs as a people. We have then to examine ourselves. Let's look more closely at what is going on. And this is the peril. And this is the peril of so-called third world nations and African nations who have been inculcated with Eurocentric values, values that they think are righteous, values that they think are good. They fail to ask good for whom and good for what. They are just told they are good. You see, it's good not to spend your money relative to somebody's race. It's bad to look at a person's race and make a decision as to whether you're going to spend or not spend. Oh, that's right, so I want to be good and I want to be righteous. It's good just to open your market and let anybody come into the market and take advantage of the market who wants to come in. So we want to be good, and therefore we cannot get access to our own market. Other people grow wealthy. Other people then create a trade imbalance. They take our wealth and stack it up in their own nations, and they use that stacked up wealth that they've gotten from our communities and our nation as the basis for their power in the world, and as the means by which they will dominate us and control our circumstances. They will take the power that they gain from owning our property and owning our wealth to maintain us in dependency, since we are the propertyless and we must earn our very subsistence based on the rules and regulations generated by those who own property. And it's property that we have given to them and permitted them to have. You cannot run a nation if its wealth is being suctioned off. I've talked to you earlier about the Opium Wars, of how China, how the British got a taste for tea, but China was the only place that was growing the tea. The British didn't have anything the Chinese wanted. It's interesting, you see how taste controls the world. And when you let other people create your taste, they also create handles and the means by which they're going to manipulate you. The whole of the empire of drug addiction and drug dealing is based on what? Taste and desire. And the manipulation of people's taste and desire. The British are addicted to tea. They became addicted to tea. I've told you before, it was their addiction to sugar that's to a great extent the reason why blacks are sprinkled throughout the Caribbean and the Americas. To feed the British sweet tooth, we were made to cut the cane and to make molasses and rum. So you can't take taste lightly. You see, because it is man's desires and tastes that motivates him to create a world and transform the world in a way that his tastes and desires are fulfilled. So then, that is why, again, you cannot let another people generate your desires and produce your desires and produce your tastes. Because when they do, when they are in control of producing for those desires and producing for those tastes, they are going to manipulate their behavior based on the taste and desires that they have created. And this is what has happened to us as a people. We have lost our African taste. We have lost the taste for things that we can produce for ourselves. We hunger most deeply for things that are produced by other people. And the other people keep producing tastes and desires in us all the time. Through TV, through radio, through newspapers, through ads. Every conceivable means of communication is used to create the taste and produce taste in black people. Taste and desires that we think represent our own individual personalities. And they make sure that the taste and desires they create are the taste and desires they alone have the means by which they can produce for them and satisfy them. Yes. And this is what happened when the British became addicted to the tea. You see, the Chinese had the tea, and the Chinese then were in a position relative to the British addicts to put conditions on their getting the tea. They said, well, you want this tea, you got to pay in silver and gold. And the British silver and gold just flowed right out of England by the tons. And it flowed out so much that it began to threaten the stability of the English government and of English society. Because you need money and wealth to run a society, not just values. I get so sick of these people talking about family values. You can't need a value. Value doesn't clothe you, shelter you, okay? But they want Negroes to believe in spookism. You know, that is values. Oh, you got to have a value. Not money, not property, not human resources, not skill, but value. And then your only problem is a result of the fact that you don't have value. You're missing family values. That's why you are suffering. Is that right? Yeah. It's amazing. You got some Negroes who go along with that business. Give the Negroes the values and give the white man the money. Give the white man the military power. Give him the intellectual power. Give him the skill. Give him all these other things, but give Negroes family values. So you got jokers talking about nothing but what? Values. Which is an amazing situation. And therefore, values must be supported. Values must be reinforced. People must be rewarded for holding certain values. It is not enough just to teach values and have people then to get into eternal trouble as a result of having those values. Having people still go hungry despite the fact that they have the values you say were so righteous for them. Having people go jobless. Having people be sick, yet they got the values. Some people have sense enough to question those values and say, the hell with these values, they're not producing anything for me. And that's why ultimately then values are rejected. It is not enough for you to teach your children the right kind of values. You must arrange it such that when they pursue those values are rewarding to them. Those values are materially supported and reinforced. but to teach them values in such a way where they continue to suffer, they continue to be dominated and controlled, where they continue to be in pain and they continue to be sick, means ultimately that they are going to reject those values. And they're going to reject the people who taught them to them. And they're going to view the people who teach those values as their enemies. And produce and see those values as a cotton cane. You wonder why they reject you. They wonder why they reject you when you try to teach them the righteous way. It's because you have no way to back those rules up and to back those values up and to make those values pay. You need to teach more than values. You need to arrange your life in such a way that those values have valuable outcomes and real outcomes for people. And so the British valued the teeth. And the Chinese then say you got to pay in gold. And the British lost their gold and silver. They realized if they didn't watch out, the government would not be able to finance itself. And the government would not be able to finance the social system. And the social system would become disorganized. And you would have social disorganization and social breakdown. The government would lose its authority. And it would not be able to generate jobs and generate wealth, and therefore support its families and support its economic infrastructure. And in not supporting its families would become disorganized and destabilized. Mothers and fathers would lose authority within the family, and the children would gain a type of self-control that would be detrimental to them. The British recognized that in terms of what was going on. And they said that we have a problem here. We must find some way of balancing this trade, of getting an exchange between China and Britain in such a way that we will be enriched through our trade with China. But since the British didn't have anything the Chinese want, what did the British do? They addicted the Chinese to what? To opium. They had control over the opium fields of India and Burma. And they shipped the opium to China against the laws of China, against the attempts of the Chinese governments to interdict this opium. It is the sale of opium that is the financial foundation of the English government. The crown of the Queen today in Buckingham Palace today is built upon the drug trade. As much of the economy of the United States is built on the drug trade today. The selling of opium and the control of opium became a British governmental monopoly. And the foundation of English power and colonial power in Hong Kong and in China and in other parts of the world was based on the selling of opium and the selling of drugs. Some of the most honored of British companies and British powerful capitalistic formations was based almost exclusively on the selling of drugs and opium. The government knew, the British government was so dependent upon the selling of drugs and opium and recognized the degree to which it contributed to its power and to its stability, until when the Chinese showed that they meant business and that in terms of keeping the opium out, the government itself went to war in 2 opium wars to make sure that the Chinese market remained what? Open. Free. To British enterprise. And the Chinese government went to war. For what reason? Because once its population, a large part of its population became addicted to opium, the British made a similar demand, didn't they? So you got to pay in what? Silver and gold. And now the Chinese silver and gold did what? Flowed in the other direction. And now the Chinese government saw itself in danger. It saw its country beginning to collapse. It not only was losing money and wealth and the means to finance itself and to generate wealth and to advance its economic interests, it also now had a major social problem, drug addiction. And it moved in to block the selling of drugs, and the British moved in to destroy their capacity to do so. And Hong Kong today is one of the major means by which, one of the things that the British acquired as a result of the Opium Wars. What are we saying here then, ladies and gentlemen? We are saying here then that you cannot permit your wealth to flow out of your community and have your community remain stable. You cannot permit your wealth to flow out of your community and have your families remain stable. You cannot permit your wealth to be sucked out of your community and advance your community's economic interests and develop its economic infrastructure and create jobs so for its members and to support the stability of its family, to appropriately educate its children, to see to the ills of those who are sick, and to advance the interest. You can't do it. It's no way possible that it can happen. And yet we're letting our wealth flow out. This is the reason why, then, you have so much crime and violence within our midst. Not only in this country, in America, but in the Caribbean as well, in Africa as well, and in other places where black people are domiciled and are residents, for essentially the same reason. Because African people not perceiving themselves as nations and not acting in terms of their national interests are permitting other people to seize their wealth and to take their wealth. You do not see crime and criminality to such a degree we see it, where you do not see an immense concentration of poverty. Even within the black communities, we pointed out, there are 7 communities or neighborhoods within New York State that generate 75% of the inmates in the state prisons. But there are many more than 7 black what? Neighborhoods in the state. And yet when you look at those neighborhoods, you will see it is in those neighborhoods that the income levels are low, that the human skills levels are low, that the educational skills and other skills are low. And most of all, blacks relative to white, you will see crime and violence occurring to its highest degree, where those people do not have control of their internal markets and control of their wealth and control of some types of human capital that they can use as a source of wealth and power. We'll hurry on here, but I just want to look at one thing. We have a project here I want to talk about. Some of you are familiar with the Pathmark project down the street, right? Yeah. East there, 125th and near 3rd Avenue, I believe. Mm-hmm. Many blacks see that as some kind of advancement for the black community. How is it sold? In terms of convenience and low prices. The same way we unemploy and justify the unemployment of these vendors out here. We have not removed not only just a so-called 1,000 vendors, we've destroyed the life not just of 1,000 people. I tell people, you know, when people say GM or some other company has cut 10,000 jobs, you should multiply that by 5. Right. That means that there may be 4 or 5 or 6 people dependent on those jobs. And so instead of 10,000 lives being disrupted, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 lives are being disrupted. Instead of then 1,000 lives being disrupted out here, there were perhaps 3, 4, 5,000 lives being disrupted. The lives of whole families are disrupted, not just the individual vendor that you saw out there on the block, but those who depended upon their earnings as a means of feeding themselves and sheltering themselves and educating themselves and protecting themselves against illnesses and other means. It was not a mere movement of vendors who happened to be selling T-shirts. It was a destruction and a destabilization of thousands of people's lives. And yet we have some jokers who justify this in terms of the convenience of getting into Woolworths. I don't have to walk around the vendors now. I can just walk right into Woolworths and get a white man all my money. Yeah. It's argued in terms of what? Convenience. Convenience. Yeah. Convenience. Oh, I hate to walk around all those vendors. Oh, the garbage in there. Oh, man. And yet, what a situation here. But this comes out of this kind of false ideology. false belief that we have here as a people. This is going to permit other people to suck the wealth of the community. We are more concerned as to whether there's garbage left on the street or whether we have to walk around a table than we are with whether the wealth of the community would be used to maintain the community itself. You got to be backwards. Whether the wealth of the community will be used to employ people in the community. Whether the wealth of the community will be used to feed and shelter and clothe the people of the community. We are more concerned as to whether we have to walk through some trash or we have to walk around and the state. What kind of false consciousness must we possess in order to have arrived at this state? Now we have some people proposing to build a path mark down the street. And they propose to say that this is an advancement for black people. Study that proposal very closely, ladies and gentlemen. This is a part of a major move on the part of a company or a non-profit corporation called LISC, called Local Initiatives Support Corporation, in partnership with some local community groups and churches. Oh yeah, because the game is the same all over, you see. Yes. And some preachers. And some other community groups along with some politicians. Yeah. Now what is this initiative? Now this initiative is going to enter into so-called partnership with these community groups to build this big supermarket and to have some attached stores and so forth. Let us say a type of mall there. Now you should get very suspicious of a situation like that. Why? First of all, you see, Negroes are deceived because LISC, this Local Initiative Support Corporation, is called a non-profit corporation. And we think when we hear the word non-profit, that means that it is charitable. Yeah, that is charity. And that way, I mean, we really let it have its way there. Yeah, you know, we just say, hey man, let's go. You know, these people are being good for us. But let me tell you something about foundations, the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, Rockefeller, all of these big foundations that we hear about, all of these non-profit agencies. Just because things are non-profit foundations does not mean that the foundation is not in the profit-making business. To a good extent, these non-profit foundations are the front men or the advanced men for their profit-making brothers. They go in and prepare the territory and prepare the ground so that their profit-making brothers can come in and take the wealth of a community. You talk about, LISC came into business with the grant from the Ford Foundation. It raised $648 million to build low-income housing. A very charitable thing, isn't it? Right? Low-cost, non-profit housing. However, stop and think. The architect who drew the plan for the house did not do it as a what? An act of charity. He or she what? Profited it from drawing those plans. The construction company, which was not black, and many of the people who worked for it, which generally are not what? Black, made a what? Profit from making non-profit housing, from making low-income housing. The furniture and other retailers who sold the furniture, who sold the other items that will go into this low-income housing, did not do it for charity. They did it for what? Profit. The plumbers and the carpenters and the electricians and all of the people and people who consult and serve take advantage of a situation. That's why we have to have our own so-called foundations and our own charity organizations. So when we decide to build low-income housing or we decide to build certain non-profit institutions, those who do make a living and profit from it will be our own. We cannot permit then other groups who in the guise of being non-profit organizations create a means by which the community will be impoverished all the more. And now this organization, and look at the people then, and one may be very suspicious of this project. After I first read, oh goodness, They're going to put in these things here. This is a nonprofit organization. But then a line caught my attention. There are investors in this project. And who are the investors? Prudential, GE Capital, yes, yes, Bank of America, yes, you mentioned Dreyfus, and the venerable J.P. Morgan. All right. So you know this is not a non-profit game. If these guys are investing in this project, they're investing in it to make money. And as I read further and I researched further, I recognized that Lisk had promised them a minimum of 10% per annum over a 10-year period on their investments. And I wondered then, where were the investors in the black community? And in what way will this community itself be able to invest in this project and gain from investing in it? I did not see it there. Where is it? In what way? I recognized then that this organization was to a degree using the local community groups and the local community churches that it was allied with, and told them that they would be in charge of the project and they would actually be the sponsors of the project. And what they would do would build the shelves and build the storefront into which Pathmark and the other stores would move. And therefore the community would get a sense that it owned the situation. But yet, the bulk of the wealth that will be gotten through the retail business will not flow through the community, but will flow out of the community. And you see that a political game was being played, because you see, if Pathmark tried to move directly into the community, the bodega boys would object to it. Yes, they're objecting to it now. The other supermarkets, the Bravos and the C-Downs and the others owned by other Asian groups would move in to block it. The Koreans would move in to block it because they would see then that that big supermarket would threaten their existence and threaten their business. And chances are they might succeed in blocking the entrance of this giant into the city by manipulating the local politicians in doing so. And Pathmark has been blocked, and other large units have been blocked as a result of local activity. As a matter of fact, one of the demands that the Koreans made in the last mayoral election of the person that they were going to give their support to as mayor was that the mayor would not change the zoning patterns of New York City so as to permit large units to be within the city and compete with them as a group. They had other demands as well. So what did we have here then? What you do then is go get a community group. Go get an influential church. Get an influential what? Minister. And group of people, and you claim it is the community that sponsored this project. Not who? Not Pathmark, not the other big chains, but the community itself. And the community then runs political interference and gets the permission and pieces the parcels together. And then these big corporate systems move into the storefronts as a result of the invasion. How slick, how interesting. And then they know Negroes do not have an ownership mentality. We have a jobs mentality because we've been conditioned into it ever since we came here. We think our existence depends on jobs, not ownership, not control. And you hear us talk about jobs all the time. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Never about ownership, never about control. And so these people come and say, we're going to give you 250 jobs. Oh, wonderful. This is how delightful. But do you realize how much money you're going to pay to buy those jobs? In other words, if you got a unit that's going to take out 30, 40, 50, 60 million dollars a year, one unit, that may pay its workers what, $500,000 or $2 million. Do you realize how much money you pay just so you can retain in your community $2 million bucks? See, we are so fascinated by jobs, we don't even see how much we're paid for the jobs we get. Suppose there's a business owned by an alien that earns $100,000 a year based on your spending with it. And it hires, let's say, 2 people that it pays a combined total of $20,000 a year to. What have you done? You paid that business $100,000 to give you back what? 20. And the business person does what? Takes out the other 80,000, and you've made progress because now you got 2 jobs where you didn't have before. This is the kind, and this is what they were. We're going to give you jobs. But you see, if you had a local resident who owned that $100,000 business and gave those 2 jobs, the whole 100,000 would do what? Remain in the community and enrich the community and become a part of the community. You just cannot be deceived because people lay a job trip on you. You want to own the job and the what? And the business. This is the source of power. This is the source of wealth. Not having some joker who's going to give you 2 pennies back for every dollar he takes out. Yet this is the kind of game that we are being permitted to run on us. And now this Lisk Foundation is planning to invade 14 inner cities across the country. Using some foundation money, but it states very clearly that it's going to only fund 30% of the project through its own money. The other 70% will be funded through regular loans and regular business loans, which means what? That these banks that ante up the money, and these